In October 1937, the Imperial Japanese Navy handed two aircraft manufacturers a set of requirements that one of them declared impossible. Nakajima read the specification, ran the numbers, and walked away from the contract entirely, while Mitsubishi stayed in and built the airplane anyway. That single decision, the one that made the Zero possible, is the same decision that 4 years later would leave its pilots burning alive in the sky over the Pacific with no armor plate between them and an incendiary round. This is the story of the Mitsubishi A6M Zero, the fighter that dominated the skies over China, Pearl Harbor, and the Dutch East Indies so completely that Allied pilots were ordered never to engage it in a turning fight. And it's also the story of how the exact engineering logic behind that dominance carried the seed of its own collapse. Start with the ending for a moment. By the summer of 1944, in the skies over the Mariana Islands, American pilots shot down Zeros in such numbers, and with such one-sided results, that the men who fought it remembered the battle as a turkey shoot. Nearly 600 Japanese aircraft went down for the loss of about 120 American ones, the same airframe, a completely different war. What changed in the 2.5 years between those two moments isn't a story about one afternoon, one battle, or one new invention. It comes down to a single set of engineering decisions made in 1937 and 1938, and how long it took the rest of the world to figure out exactly what those decisions had traded away. On October 5, 1937, the Imperial Japanese Navy issued what it called the planning requirements for the prototype 12-shire carrier-based fighter, 12-shire meaning the 12th year of the Showa era, and sent it to two companies, Mitsubishi and Nakajima. The requirements had been revised on the back of Japan's own combat experience with its previous fighter, the A5M, over China. The Navy wanted a top speed of roughly 500 kilometers per hour, about 270 knots, at 4,000 meters, and it wanted a climb rate that outpaced anything flying. Sources on the exact climb figure diverge, with the specification variously described as demanding a climb to 3,000 meters in as little as 3.5 minutes or as much as 9.5, and this account names that discrepancy rather than quietly picking a side. Beyond that, the Navy wanted an aircraft that could stay airborne for 2 hours at normal power, or between 6 and 8 hours cruising economically with drop tanks, endurance numbers that belonged to a bomber rather than a fighter. It wanted two 20mm cannon and two 7.7mm machine guns, the capacity to carry two 60-kilogram bombs, and a full radio set with a direction finder for navigation on missions that would take the aircraft hundreds of miles from its carrier. And it wanted maneuverability at least equal to the A5M it was replacing, an aircraft already regarded as exceptionally nimble, all while fitting within a wingspan under 12 meters so it could ride the elevators of a Japanese carrier. Nakajima's engineers looked at that list and concluded it couldn't be built, and on January 17, 1938, the company formally withdrew from the competition. Mitsubishi's chief designer, a University of Tokyo-trained aeronautical engineer named Jiro Horikoshi, reached a different conclusion. Horikoshi believed the specification could only be met through radical, uncompromising weight reduction, not as a design preference, but as the entire design philosophy. Inside the Navy itself, nobody agreed on what this airplane was even supposed to be. At a meeting on April 13, 1938, IJN officers split over priorities, with one faction tied to the tactical thinking of officers like Minoru Jinda, pushing for maneuverability above everything else, a fighter that could outturn anything it met. Commander Takeo Shibata argued the opposite, insisting speed and range mattered more than a tight turning radius. The meeting ended without resolution, and Horikoshi stepped in and promised the Navy a design that could satisfy both camps at once. That promise turns out to be the hinge the entire story swings on. Horikoshi wasn't proposing a compromise between speed and maneuverability in the usual sense, trading a bit of one for a bit of the other. He was proposing to strip weight so aggressively from every other part of the airframe that the aircraft could have both, because it would carry almost nothing else. It helps to understand why the Navy wanted this combination in the first place, rather than treating the specification as some arbitrary engineering puzzle. Japan's naval planners were building around a doctrine of carrier aviation projected across enormous distances of open Pacific water, where the nearest friendly airfield might sit hundreds of miles away, and a fighter that ran out of fuel over open ocean simply didn't come home. Range wasn't a luxury bolted onto a fighter design. It was close to a survival requirement for the kind of war Japan expected to fight. Long-range strikes launched from carriers operating far from land, with no margin for a short-legged aircraft that couldn't escort a strike force to its target and back. Here is where the popular telling of the Zero's story usually goes wrong, and where this account is going to depart from it. The common version says the Zero was a brilliant fighter with a fatal, almost careless flaw: no armor for the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks, an airplane that would catch fire if you looked at it wrong. And the implication is usually that Japanese engineers simply didn't think about survivability or didn't care about their pilots. The research doesn't support that framing. What it supports is something colder and more interesting: that the missing armor and the missing self-sealing tanks weren't oversights. They were the price Horikoshi's team consciously paid to hit a specification that a rival manufacturer had already declared physically impossible. Mitsubishi's engineers used a new aluminum-zinc alloy from Sumitomo, marketed as extra super duralumin, a material lighter and stronger than what most contemporary fighters were built from. They used flush riveting to cut drag, designed retractable, wide-set landing gear, and in the airframe's most distinctive structural choice, built an integral wing, a single unit that doubled as the cockpit floor and housed large internal fuel tanks, which explains a good part of why the Zero could fly so much farther than the fighters it would eventually meet in combat. Each of these choices reinforced the others, and they function as a system rather than a list. The lighter alloy meant less structural mass for a given strength, which meant the wing could be built thinner and lighter, which meant less weight for the engine to haul into the air, which meant the engine didn't need to be as large or powerful to hit the Navy's speed and climb targets, freeing up still more weight budget elsewhere in the airframe. It's a virtuous cycle of performance is the only priority, and it turns vicious the moment you try to add anything back in, because every gram added anywhere in the airframe pulls against every other gain the system was built around. Modern engineering runs into this same trade-off constantly. Formula One designers and commercial aircraft manufacturers obsess over exactly this problem, since every kilogram removed from a vehicle's structure becomes speed, or payload, or range, but it never becomes safety margin for free. A modern F1 chassis is built to a minimum weight limit specifically because engineers, left unconstrained, will strip weight until the safety margin disappears entirely. Horikoshi had no such regulatory floor in 1938. He had a Navy spec demanding speed, range, and maneuverability all at once, with no equivalent requirement forcing him to protect the man in the cockpit. And the airplane he built is what happens when that constraint simply doesn't exist. The structural safety factors on the A6M were deliberately reduced below what more conservative designs would have used, and most consequentially, there was no armor plate behind the pilot's seat and no self-sealing fuel tanks, the rubberized lining that lets a tank absorb a bullet strike without igniting, which by the early 1940s was becoming standard on American fighter designs. That omission mattered in very practical terms for the men flying the aircraft. A hit to an unprotected fuel tank on a Zero carried a meaningfully higher chance of igniting the aircraft than an equivalent hit on a Wildcat or a later American fighter built with self-sealing linings as standard equipment. And that single design choice, not a mysterious flaw, but a specific, identifiable material decision left out to save weight, is a documented part of why Zero losses so often meant pilot losses too, in a way that wasn't equally true for their American counterparts. None of this was an accident, and none of it was indifference. It was arithmetic. Every kilogram of armor plate came directly out of the climb rate, the turn radius, or the range the Navy had specified as non-negotiable, and Horikoshi built exactly the airplane he was asked to build. The trade-off was baked into the order, not smuggled into the execution. This deserves to stay an open historiographical question rather than get settled here, because both readings have real defenders. One position treats the missing armor as a rational engineering response to an impossible specification and a doctrine built around long-range carrier strikes, where a heavier, better protected aircraft simply couldn't have hit the range and performance numbers the Navy required in the first place. The opposing position treats it as a structural flaw baked into Japanese naval aviation doctrine more broadly, a design philosophy that prioritized the outcome of the first engagement over the survivability of the pilot across a long war of attrition. At a moment when Japan could least afford to lose experienced aircrew it had no reliable way to replace. Both claims keep showing up in different forms as this story goes on. Weight reduction only solved half the equation. Power was the other half, and here's a detail that rarely makes it into popular accounts. Horikoshi didn't actually want the engine his fighter first flew with. That initial prototype, designated the A6M, ran on the Mitsubishi ZCI-13 engine, producing 780 horsepower, but Horikoshi's own preference from the start was a different, more powerful Mitsubishi engine, the Kinsei. Navy officials rejected it, considering the Kinsei too large and too heavy for what the specification demanded, so the design moved forward without it. Think about what that rejection actually meant in practice. Mitsubishi had just been handed a specification so demanding that a rival manufacturer refused to even attempt it. And then, at the exact moment its own chief designer proposed the more powerful engine that might have made the weight reduction strategy less extreme, the Navy said no, on the grounds that the more powerful option was too heavy. One institution had set an almost impossible performance bar and was simultaneously narrowing the tools available to meet it. That's not a contradiction unique to this program. Bureaucracies routinely constrain the very solutions their own requirements demand, but it complicates any account of the Zero's design history that treats Horikoshi as operating with a free hand. The fix came from the other manufacturer in this story. The same Nakajima that had walked away from the airframe contract was still in the business of building engines. And it was a Nakajima power plant, the Sakai 12, producing 940 horsepower, that the Navy directed onto the third prototype. That switch became the A6M2, and it's the version that pushed performance past what the original specification had even asked for. Hold on to that detail about the Kinsei, because it comes back near the end of this story, at a moment when its absence stops being a footnote and becomes the reason Japan couldn't fix the airplanes. Problems when it needed to most. The A6M prototype flew for the first time on April 1, 1939, at Kagamigahara Airfield near Nagoya, with test pilot Katsuzo Shima at the controls, and by September 14 of that year the aircraft had been formally accepted as the A6M. January 1940 brought the first completed A6M2, the version fitted with the more powerful Sakai engine. The program wasn't without cost even before it reached combat. In March 1940, the second prototype was lost in a mid-air explosion that killed the test pilot, and the cause was never determined. Stated plainly, without dramatizing it, an aircraft built around the aggressive elimination of structural margin was, unsurprisingly, an aircraft that occasionally failed in ways nobody could fully explain. That unresolved crash sits at an uncomfortable point in this story, and the underlying research treats it with the same restraint, an unexplained loss rather than proof of any specific design failure. Context still matters here. This airframe had been built specifically by cutting every margin the specification allowed. And when a program built that way loses an aircraft to an unexplained mid-air failure during its earliest test flights, that context doesn't prove causation, but it isn't irrelevant either. Leaving it out in favor of a clean, uninterrupted march toward acceptance would be leaving something out that matters. 15 pre-production A6M2s were assigned to the 12th Combined Air Group for trials in China on July 21, 1940, and 10 days later, on July 31, the Navy formally accepted the type as the Navy Type 0 carrier fighter, Model 11. The name history would shorten to 0, taken from the last digit of the Japanese imperial year 2600. The Zero's first combat mission came on August 19, 1940, a bomber escort run over Chungking that found no aerial opposition at all. Real air-to-air victories followed less than a month later, on September 13, 1940, when 13 A6M2s under Lieutenant Saburo Shindo engaged Chinese fighters, I-15s and I-16s, over Chongqing. This is where the popular legend of the Zero begins, and the legend and the record diverge almost immediately. The widely repeated version of that engagement claims 13 Zeros shot down 27 Chinese aircraft without a single loss, a result so lopsided it became the seed of the Zero's reputation as an unbeatable weapon, one that both Japanese propaganda and later Western popular history were happy to repeat. Chinese records from the same engagement tell a Messier story. Major Louis Yim Kun brought his I-15 home with 48 bullet holes in it, surviving but hit badly. Lieutenant Gao Yoshin claimed a Zero shot down, and up to 4 Zeros came back damaged. None of that fits cleanly into a story about a flawless, one-sided massacre. Notice what each side got out of repeating the inflated version anyway. For the Imperial Japanese Navy in 1940, a story about an unbeatable new fighter made valuable propaganda at home and a useful signal of strength abroad, regardless of what actually happened in that specific engagement. Decades later, for Western popular historians writing about the opening months of the Pacific War, the same inflated story simply made a more dramatic setup for the shock of Pearl Harbor, since a mysterious, unstoppable weapon appearing out of nowhere makes for better narrative than a genuinely strong fighter that had, in its very first serious combat test, taken real damage and lost at least one confirmed engagement. This matters for reasons that reach well beyond one afternoon over Chongqing. The Zero's legend as an invincible aircraft was built from overclaimed victory reports from its very first serious engagement, before Pearl Harbor, before Coral Sea, before a single American pilot had ever seen one in the air. The mythology didn't start with wartime propaganda dressing up an already proven weapon. It started with a battle report that inflated the result from the beginning, and every telling after that, Japanese and later American, built on top of that inflated foundation instead of correcting it. There's a pattern here that shows up constantly in modern intelligence and financial analysis, where the first report of an event is almost never the most accurate one, and yet it's the one that gets repeated the most, because it arrived first, and nobody goes back to correct the record once the narrative has set. Analysts call it anchoring. The first number you hear becomes the reference point every later number gets measured against, even after better data arrives. The Zero's reputation for invincibility anchored in September 1940, and neither Japanese nor Allied accounts spent much energy dislodging it for the next 2 years, because an invincible weapon made a better story for both sides, for very different reasons. A broader argument some historians make about the entire China period complicates the invincible machine framing even further. The opposition the Zero faced in China through 1940 and into 1941 was, by any honest assessment, second-rate. Chinese air units flying older, less capable aircraft, without anything close to the training depth of a modern peer air force. A dominant record against that kind of opposition tells you comparatively little about how the airplane would perform against a fully modern air force with comparable pilot training. It would take Pearl Harbor and everything that followed to actually answer that question, and the answer that came back over the next 2 years turned out to be more complicated than the China record alone would have predicted. Keep that China record in mind moving forward, because it sets up a pattern that repeats at nearly every major turning point in this story. A first report that overstates the result, a reputation that outlives the underlying reality, and a correction that in several cases took decades of archival research on both sides of the Pacific to actually surface. By the time Japan struck Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the Zero was no longer a promising prototype. It was the backbone of Japanese naval aviation. 521 Zeros were active across the Pacific theater, with 328 in first-line combat units, and the carrier strike force that hit Pearl Harbor deployed roughly 408 operational aircraft in total. 43 Zeros escorted the first wave that morning, 35 escorted the second, flying in a secondary, ground attack role rather than as the main striking force, since the main damage at Pearl Harbor came from torpedo and dive bombers. Precision matters here, since vague description is exactly what let the Zero's reputation drift into myth in the first place. The A6M Model 21, the primary early war variant, had a top speed of 533 kilometers per hour or 331 miles per hour at roughly 4,550 meters, and it could climb to 6,000 meters in 7 minutes and 27 seconds. Its service ceiling reached roughly 10,000 meters, and its range under normal load ran to about 1,010 nautical miles, extendable to nearly 1,930 miles with a drop tank, a figure that dwarfed contemporary American carrier fighters. Wing loading is the number that explains almost everything else about how the Zero flew. 107.4 kilograms per square meter, about 22 pounds per square foot, an exceptionally low figure that follows directly from everything already covered, since stripping enough weight from an airframe produces an airplane that turns like almost nothing else in the sky, with less mass fighting the airflow over a given amount of wing surface. The production numbers behind this aircraft deserve the same precision, because the scale of the program is easy to understate. Mitsubishi and Nakajima together built roughly 10,449 single-seat Zero fighters across the war, broken down by Japanese fiscal year, 837 between March 1939 and March 1942, covering the pre-war and opening war period, 1,689 more between April 1942 and March 1943. A sharp jump to 3,432 between April 1943 and March 1944, the program's peak year, 3,487 the following fiscal year, and a final 1,004 in the last months of the war, between April and August 1945, right up to Japan's surrender. Nakajima, the same company that originally refused the airframe contract as impossible, ended up building the majority of them, roughly 6,570 against Mitsubishi's 3,879, a detail easy to miss given how closely Horikoshi's name gets attached to the aircraft's identity. The broader figure sometimes cited for all Zero versions, closer to 10,900, includes floatplane variants and trainers built on the same airframe, and shouldn't be read as a contradiction of the fighter-specific total, since the two figures are simply counting different things. Armament ran to two 7.7mm machine guns in the cowling and two 20mm cannon in the wings, though early production carried only 60 rounds per cannon, working out to roughly 10 seconds of cannon fire before a pilot dropped down to machine guns alone. That ammunition limit deserves a moment of attention, since it's another small illustration of the same weight versus capability trade-off running through this entire story. A 20mm cannon round is a genuinely effective weapon against another fighter, far more destructive per hit than a rifle-caliber machine gun round. But cannon rounds and their feed mechanisms are heavy, and 60 rounds per gun was the number Mitsubishi's engineers judged the airframe could carry without eating further into the performance figures the Navy had specified. In practice, that meant a Zero pilot who missed his opening cannon burst, or who needed a second pass to finish an opponent, was very quickly back to fighting with machine guns alone, a real tactical constraint hiding inside an otherwise impressive-looking armament sheet. Against the American Grumman F-4F Wildcat, the fighter it met most often in 1942, the Zero held a clear edge in speed, climb rate, and maneuverability, while the Wildcat held its own advantages, 6.5 caliber machine guns compared to the Zero's mixed and limited armament, armor protection the Zero lacked entirely, and a pressure injection carburetor that let it dive and maneuver under -G without the engine cutting out, a problem that plagued the Zero's float-type carburetor and one Allied pilots would learn to exploit specifically. The maneuverability advantage had a hard physical ceiling, and naming it precisely matters more than leaving it as a vague impression. At around 160 miles per hour, the Zero's roll rate ran to about 56 degrees per second, genuinely exceptional, but that number collapsed as airspeed climbed, falling toward zero by roughly 300 miles per hour. Above about 280 miles an hour, the controls stiffened noticeably. Above 300 rolling became difficult, and above 350 the ailerons and elevators were nearly immovable. This is the same underlying physics behind the low wing loading that made the Zero so dangerous at low speed and in a slow-turning fight, and the same physics that made it comparatively easy to escape from at high speed for a pilot who knew to use it. 2 months before Pearl Harbor's one-year anniversary, on February 19, 1942, the Zero demonstrated its range and reach again during the raid on Darwin, Australia, a strike involving 188 carrier aircraft, with 9 Zeros opening the attack by strafing the merchant ship HMES Gunbar before the main strike force arrived. The Zero's advantage wasn't limited to American aircraft either. A comparative test in August 1943, pitting a captured Zero against a Spitfire, had the test pilots concluding that the Spitfire was outclassed by the Zero at every altitude up to 20,000 feet. The A6M variant tested could outturn the Spitfire outright and carried roughly 3 times its range. A reminder that the Zero's dominance in 1942 wasn't a story about one weak Allied fighter design. It was a story about an airplane that, within its performance envelope, outmaneuvered nearly everything the Allies had in the air at that stage of the war. June 4, 1942, stands as the single busiest date in this story, and it deserves to be treated that way rather than split across 2 separate narratives the way most retellings handle it. At midway that day, American pilots deployed a defensive maneuver for the first time in combat, a tactic developed by Lieutenant Commander John Thatch and known ever since as the Thatch Weave. The concept was simple in principle and demanding in execution: 2 fighters flying a loose formation, each covering the other's blind spot by continuously crossing paths, so that any enemy aircraft that got onto one American fighter's tail flew directly into the gun sights of the second. Thatch's own account of the tactic in action describes one of the Japanese fighters making a pass at his wingman, pulling out, and coming back around, at which point the Weave put Thatch in position for a head-on shot. The Thatch Weave didn't require a better airplane. It required smarter use of an inferior one, and that distinction matters enormously later in this story. A second correction belongs here too, separate from the Thatch Weave story, and just as important, since it directly involves how the Zero usually gets written into that battle. For decades, the popular account held that the doomed American torpedo bomber squadrons, flying in low, unescorted, and cut to pieces, served an accidental purpose, supposedly dragging the Japanese combat air patrol of Zeros down to low altitude, out of position, clearing the way for American dive bombers to strike the Japanese carriers essentially unopposed from above. Modern reassessment of the battle, built on Japanese primary sources rather than the discredited post-war Japanese accounts that shaped the earlier narrative, complicates that story significantly. A Zero was capable of regaining altitude within minutes, and there was no structural reason a combat air patrol pulled low by one attack couldn't have climbed back into position before the next one arrived. The real distortion of the Japanese patrol that morning wasn't vertical, pulling Zeros down to sea level. It was lateral. The patrol got pulled sideways, chasing an earlier wave of attackers in the wrong direction, away from where the dive bombers actually approached from. The dive bombers arrived essentially unmolested not because the Zeros were trapped down low, but because they were looking the wrong way entirely. This correction matters for the same reason the Akutan Zero correction will matter a little further on, as a reminder that a large amount of what's commonly repeated about this airplane's most famous battles was shaped by convenient, dramatic post-war narratives more than by what the operational record actually shows. This particular reassessment traces back to a body of modern scholarship that went back to Japanese deck logs, damage reports, and after-action records rather than relying on the post-war interviews and memoirs, several written by Japanese officers with their own reputations to manage, that had shaped Western understanding of Midway for decades after the war. It's the same basic method behind several of the corrections in this account. Not new discoveries so much as old sources read more carefully and cross-checked more rigorously than the first generation of post-war historians had the access or the incentive to do. On that exact same day, more than 2,000 miles away in the Aleutian Islands, a 22-year-old Japanese naval aviator named Tadayoshi Koga was flying an A6M Zero off the carrier Ryujo during the Japanese raid on Dutch Harbor. A severed oil line forced him down, and he attempted a landing on Akutan Island. But the ground gave way. Soft, boggy terrain the Japanese had specifically scouted as a rally point for exactly this kind of emergency, and that turned out to be nowhere near solid enough. The aircraft flipped on landing, Koga died on impact, and his fighter, nearly intact, sat undiscovered in that bog for over a month. Two separate stories, one American tactical innovation proving itself in combat, one historical myth about that same battle that better sourcing has since corrected, and one nearly undamaged Japanese aircraft sitting in the mud waiting to be found, all three tracing back to the same afternoon. Koga's Down Zero, serial number 4593, was spotted from the air on July 10, 1942, by a PBY Catalina crew from Patrol Squadron 41 under Lieutenant William Thies, and it took 3 separate recovery attempts before American personnel could extract the aircraft from the bog and ship it to Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego. It was, at that point, the first substantially intact captured Zero the Allies had gotten their hands on. There's a bitter irony buried in exactly how that crash happened. Akutan Island had been specifically identified in advance by Japanese planners as a designated emergency rally point, a place damaged aircraft from the Dutch Harbor raid could try to put down if they couldn't make it back to their carrier. The terrain that killed Koga wasn't some random, unlucky patch of ground. It was the exact spot Japanese mission planning had picked out as the safest available option for a pilot in his situation, and it turned out to be nowhere near solid enough to survive a landing on. The same planning that tried to protect pilots like Koga put his aircraft and his body directly in the path of the men who would spend the next month searching that island from the air. Getting the aircraft out of that bog was itself a slow, deliberate operation, not a quick salvage job. More than a month passed between the crash and the moment recovery crews located the wreck, and repeated attempts followed before the airplane could be pulled clear of the terrain that had killed its pilot in the first place. Every stage of that process, the spotting, the extraction, the shipping south to California, the rebuild, consumed time, which matters given what comes next in this story. On September 20th, 1942, more than 2 months after the crash, and well over 2 months after Midway, the aircraft was rebuilt and test-flown for the first time by Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders, whose own report on that first flight is direct about what it revealed, that the very first flight exposed weaknesses in the Zero American pilots could exploit with proper tactics. The value of what came out of those test flights is hard to overstate, but the exact nature of that value matters. Testing confirmed and quantified problems combat pilots had already started to suspect that the controls stiffened badly above roughly 200 knots. The aircraft rolled more easily to the left than to the right, and, critically, the float-type carburetor caused the engine to cut out under -G, meaning a Zero pilot pushing into a dive to escape could lose engine power at exactly the wrong moment. American test pilot Frederick Trapnell, flying the aircraft on October 6, 1942, put it plainly, that the general impression of the airplane matched exactly what intelligence had already assembled, performance included. That last detail is easy to read past, and it shouldn't be. Trapnell wasn't describing a revelation, he was describing confirmation, a match between what American intelligence already believed about the Zero and what the physical aircraft, once flown, actually did. Testing didn't overturn existing assumptions about the Zero, it verified them, with hard flight data rather than pilot report and speculation. A genuinely different and more limited kind of contribution than the popular version of this story usually credits it with. Fighter ace Kenneth Walsh, credited with 21 aerial victories, later said that knowing what to do with the Zero on his tail, information that traced directly back to Koga's aircraft, saved his life on multiple occasions, and fellow ace William Leonard called the captured Zero a treasure, adding that to his knowledge no other single captured aircraft had unlocked so many secrets at a moment when the need for them was so great. This is where the account is going to directly contradict one of the most widely repeated claims in the entire Zero legend. The idea that the Akutan Zero's capture is what allowed American engineers to design the Grumman F-6F Hellcat, the fighter that would eventually break the Zero's dominance for good. The dates don't support it. Grumman's prototype that became the Hellcat, the XF-6F-1, was ordered on June 30th, 1941, a full year before Koga's crash landing on Akutan Island. That aircraft made its first flight on June 26, 1942, before the wreck had even been extracted from the bog, and large production orders had already gone out in May 1942, a full 2 months before anyone had recovered an intact Zero to study. Its design was already locked before the Akutan Zero existed as a flyable object. Lay those dates side by side, and the sequence becomes impossible to reconcile with the popular version of events. Order date, June 1941. Crash date, June 1942. First flight of the American fighter, June 1942, the same week the Zero still sat undiscovered in an Alaskan bog. Production orders for the Hellcat went out in May 1942, before the wreck had even been spotted from the air. There is no point in that timeline where information from Koga's aircraft could have reached Grumman's design office in time to shape a single rivet of the Hellcat's airframe. What the Akutan Zero changed wasn't the airplane, it was the pilots. The test data from Koga's fighter shaped tactics and training, telling American aviators exactly where the Zero was weak and how to fight around those weaknesses, but it arrived after the design decisions for the aircraft that would eventually outfly the Zero had already been made. A second, less comfortable question follows from that. One the research doesn't fully resolve either way. How necessary was the Akutan Zero in the first place? Combat pilots at Coral Sea, at Midway, and in the opening months over Guadalcanal had already begun learning the Zero's weaknesses directly through combat experience, before the captured aircraft's test reports had circulated widely. 9 wrecked Zeros had already been recovered at Pearl Harbor in December 1941, and other partial examples existed before Akutan as well. One recovered on Melville Island in February 1942, another at Cape Rodney in New Guinea, and a reconstruction assembled from wreckage in China by an American engineer named Gerhard Neumann. The Akutan Zero survived into popular memory because it was the most complete, the most dramatic, and the best documented example, not necessarily because it was the only source, or even the primary one, for what American pilots eventually learned. None of this diminishes what the recovery accomplished. It confirmed exploitable weaknesses with hard data rather than pilot rumor, and it almost certainly saved lives. But the popular version of this story, captured plane reverse-engineered into a war-winning fighter, gets the mechanism backward. The tactics changed because of Akutan. The airplane that mattered most had already been designed without it. There's a reason this particular myth took hold so firmly, and it's the same storytelling instinct that shaped the China combat reports earlier in this story. A single dramatic recovery, a crashed enemy fighter pulled from an Alaskan bog, rebuilt, and flown against its own countrymen, makes a far better story than the actual, more diffuse truth that a purpose-built American fighter had already been ordered a year before the crash, and that combat pilots were already learning the Zero's weaknesses the hard way, one dogfight at a time, well before any single captured airframe entered the picture. Two of the most consequential corrections in this account, the China overclaiming and the Akutan to Hellcat myth, work the same way. In each case, the popular version replaces a slower, messier, multi-causal reality with a single dramatic event that's easier to remember and easier to tell. That's close to a universal pattern in how popular military history gets simplified for a general audience. And the Zero happens to be an unusually clean case study of it, since so much of its legend was built and repeated across 2 different national historiographical traditions that had very different reasons to prefer the simpler version. The 8 months between the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 and the end of major air combat over Guadalcanal in February 1943 tell a story that complicates the simple version of how the Zero's dominance ended. Wildcat versus Zero exchange rates. tracked across this period, show a steady shift even though the Wildcat itself did not meaningfully change. During Coral Sea, from May 4th through the 8th, 14 Zeros went down against 10 Wildcats lost, not yet a decisive American advantage. Across the period from August 7th through November 15th, 1942, 72 Zeros were shot down against 70 Wildcats, essentially even, and in the carrier battles across that same window, 43 Zeros were lost against 31 Wildcats. By the time organized air combat over Guadalcanal effectively concluded, on February 3, 1943, the cumulative ratio had shifted to nearly 6 Zeros lost for every Wildcat, and by the end of the war the all-time Wildcat versus Zero figure stood at just under 7-1 in the American fighters' favor. Here's the detail that deserves more attention than it usually gets. That shift happened almost entirely before the F-6F Hellcat or the F-4U Corsair had entered combat. The Wildcat that fought at Guadalcanal in late 1942 was, airframe for airframe, the same Wildcat that had struggled at Coral Sea 7 months earlier. What changed wasn't the machine, it was the men flying it, and the tactics they'd built specifically to neutralize what the Zero did well. The thatch weave is part of that story, but not the whole of it. American pilots learned, through hard combat experience layered on top of the Akutan test data, to refuse the fight the Zero wanted, never turning with a Zero below roughly 300 miles an hour, using altitude and diving speed, where the Wildcat's structural strength and heavier armament gave it the advantage, rather than the horizontal turning fight, where the Zero's low-wing loading made it unbeatable. Dive away, extend, and come back. Never linger in a slow-turning engagement where the Zero's entire design advantage came into play. This is a genuinely inconvenient fact for the version of the story that credits new American aircraft with beating the Zero. The Wildcat beat the Zero's early war dominance first, with the same airplane it had been losing with a year earlier, purely through tactics and pilot judgment, and the new aircraft arrived afterward, turning an already shifting fight into a rout. It helps to be specific about what refusing the fight the Zero wanted actually meant in practice for a Wildcat pilot in late 1942, since the phrase can sound abstract without the underlying logic behind it. Every advantage already documented about the Zero, the exceptional roll rate at low speed, the tight turning radius, the low wing loading, held true specifically in a slow, horizontal turning fight, the classic image of a dogfight, and every one of those advantages degraded or vanished at high speed, where the Zero's control stiffened and its ability to maneuver collapsed. A Wildcat pilot who understood that distinction and who had the discipline to act on it under combat stress effectively chose which fight to have. Engage low and slow, and the Zero would very likely win. Engage fast, using altitude and a diving attack, and the advantage flipped to the heavier, more structurally rugged American fighter. That discipline, refusing an instinctive, dramatic turning fight in favor of a less satisfying but far more survivable diving attack, is itself a form of skill, and it's the skill that closed most of the gap between the two aircraft before either side built anything new. Name the actual historiographical disagreement underneath everything covered so far, because serious historians land in genuinely different places on it. One school treats the Zero's early dominance as fundamentally a story about the machine, and there's real support for that view. British test pilot Eric Brown, who flew captured Axis aircraft for the Royal Navy, said flatly that he had never flown a fighter that could match the Zero's rate of turn, calling it the finest fighter in the world until roughly mid-1943, and that's not a minor endorsement, since Brown flew nearly everything the war produced, on both sides, and his comparative judgment carries weight. The opposing school argues the machine gets too much credit relative to the circumstances it fought in. A frequently cited historical reassessment of the Zero's reputation makes the case directly that much of the early kill record was compiled against poorly trained and poorly led Allied pilots, and against second-rate opposition more broadly, and by that reading, the Zero's genuinely dominant combat career, measured strictly against comparably trained and equipped opponents, ran for a matter of months rather than years. Both of these positions are defensible, And the honest answer is that they aren't actually mutually exclusive. The Zero was, by design, an exceptional turning fighter, and Eric Brown's testimony on that point is hard to dismiss. While it's simultaneously true that a large share of its most lopsided early results came against opposition that gave it every advantage a design like this needed to look unbeatable. Put those two things together, rather than picking one, and you get something close to what the rest of this story has already been building toward: an airplane whose real strengths were genuine, and whose reputation for invincibility was inflated well past what those strengths alone could sustain once it met pilots and machines built specifically to deny it the fight it wanted. By early 1943, the airplanes designed from the outset to beat the Zero began reaching frontline squadrons. The Vought F-4U Corsair arrived in February 1943, and the Grumman F-6F Hellcat, whose design timeline, as already established, predates the Akutan Zero entirely, reached combat units in September 1943. Roughly the same time, the A6M Model 52, an upgraded Zero variant, was entering Japanese service to meet them. It helps to be clear about what purpose-built meant for these two American designs, since it's the direct mirror image of the Zero's own 1937 design brief, where Horikoshi had been handed a specification demanding speed, range, and maneuverability with no protection requirement attached. Grumman and Vought were designing fighters specifically informed by 2 years of accumulated combat reports on exactly what the Zero could and couldn't do. Rather than trying to outturn the Zero, chasing the one performance category where the Japanese fighter's low-wing loading made it nearly unbeatable, both American designs leaned into raw power, structural strength, and high-speed performance, the categories where a heavier, more powerful, better protected airframe held every advantage. They weren't better all-around fighters than the Zero in some abstract sense. They were fighters engineered specifically to make the Zero fight on the American aircraft's terms rather than its own. The same principle behind the Thatch Weave and the never turn below 300 miles an hour doctrine that Wildcat pilots had already worked out by instinct and hard experience, now built directly into the airframe itself rather than left to pilot discipline alone. Commonly cited kill ratios for these two American fighters run extraordinary. Pilots credit the Hellcat with a shoot-down-to-loss ratio around 19-1, said to account for roughly 3/4 of all U.S. Navy and Marine Corps air-to-air victories against Japan, and the Corsair's figure is usually put at around 11-1. Those numbers deserve a note of caution rather than blind repetition, because kill ratio claims from any air force in this war were subject to heavy overclaiming. The same overclaiming problem that inflated the Zero's own reputation over China. Even the numbers from the Marianas Turkey shoot, examined closely in a moment, run closer to 10-1 for pure air combat once operational losses and other factors are separated out, rather than the even more lopsided figures sometimes quoted, 19-1 and 11-1. Then, should be understood as widely cited claims rather than fully audited combat results. What's not in dispute is the direction of the trend, that by late 1943, American aircraft purpose-built to counter the Zero's strengths, flown by a pilot training pipeline capable of replacing losses at scale, had turned what was already a shifting fight into a one-sided one. That phrase, a pilot training pipeline capable of replacing losses at scale, is doing a lot of work, and it deserves unpacking rather than getting left as a throwaway line, since it connects directly to a structural difference between the two air forces that goes well beyond any single aircraft's specifications. The United States entered the war with the industrial capacity not just to build fighters in enormous numbers, but to run flight schools that could churn out replacement pilots continuously, at a volume that could absorb the loss rates of a multi-year air war without the training pipeline itself collapsing. That capacity stays invisible in any single dogfight, and only becomes visible in the aggregate, across years, in the shape of exactly the kind of exchange ratio trend this story has been tracking since Guadalcanal. There's a structural difference between how the United States and Japan manage their most experienced fighter pilots, and it may matter more to this story than any single piece of hardware. Call it a deliberate institutional choice rather than an accident of circumstance, because both navies faced the same underlying problem: a finite supply of pilots skilled enough to get the most out of a demanding aircraft and a war likely to run for years, and each chose to solve it in opposite ways. The U.S. Navy rotated its aces out of combat and back to training commands. John Thatch himself was pulled from frontline flying after Midway specifically, so his knowledge could be taught to new pilots entering the fleet, and that rotation meant experienced combat judgment kept multiplying outward across the pilot training pipeline throughout the war, even as individual aces stopped flying combat missions personally. Japan's approach ran close to the opposite. Its most skilled pilots stayed in combat continuously, flying mission after mission until they were killed, wounded, or the war ended around them. Saburo Sakai, one of the most experienced Zero pilots of the war, is officially credited with 28 aerial victories under Japanese military records, though the far higher figure of 64 commonly attached to his name actually originates from Martin Kaiden, the American co-author of Sakai's memoir Samurai, and not from any official count. Sakai survived the war. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, credited with 36 individually confirmed victories and known to Allied pilots as one of Japan's deadliest aces, did not. Killed as a passenger aboard a transport aircraft on October 26, 1944, after years of continuous front-line combat flying. Look at what those two outcomes actually represent. Sakai survived the war carrying an enormous amount of hard-won combat knowledge, the kind of knowledge that, in the American system, would have been pulled out of the cockpit years earlier and pushed into a training syllabus for new pilots. Nishizawa never left combat long enough for that knowledge to be captured at all before he was killed, not even in air-to-air combat, but as a passenger on a transport flight. Multiply that pattern across the hundreds of experienced Japanese naval aviators who flew the Zero from 1941 onward, and the result isn't really about any single pilot's fate. It's about what happens to an Air Force's collective skill level when its best people get treated as an expendable resource rather than a multiplying one. This same failure mode shows up, structurally, in any organization that burns its most capable people rather than rotating them into roles where their knowledge compounds. A veteran surgeon kept in the operating room around the clock, with no time to train residents, produces excellent outcomes for exactly as long as that surgeon survives the schedule, and then the hospital has nothing left when they don't. U.S. Navy doctrine treated its best pilots as a resource to be extracted and multiplied, while Imperial Japanese Navy doctrine treated its best pilots as a resource to be spent. Both systems produced extraordinary individual results in the short term, but only one of them scaled. By the later years of the war, this asymmetry compounded with everything already discussed: the aircraft's design trade-offs, the arrival of purpose-built American counters to produce Japanese air units increasingly staffed by less experienced pilots, flying an airframe that had always demanded a skilled hand to exploit its strengths and avoid its vulnerabilities. One more note on Sakai's own record belongs here, since it's a small but useful case study in how this entire mythology gets built and retold. Sakai's memoir, Samurai, was co-written with American author Martin Kaiden, and at least one dramatic episode in that book, an aerobatics display staged over Port Moresby, has been identified as something closer to invention than memory, credited to Kaiden's imagination rather than Sakai's actual experience. Even the circumstances of Sakai's own near-fatal wounding on August 7, 1942, get misidentified in the book, which describes his attackers as Avenger torpedo planes, when the aircraft that actually wounded him, according to later research, were SBD Dauntless dive bombers. None of this erases Sakai's genuine record as one of the most capable pilots to fly the Zero, but it's a reminder that even the most cited primary source memoirs behind this airplane's legend were shaped, edited, and in places dramatized for a Western readership, the same pattern of storytelling pressure that inflated the China combat record, showing up again in how the Zero's individual pilots were remembered. Go back to the detail about the engine Horikoshi actually wanted and the one the Navy gave him instead. By the middle of the war, The consequence of that early decision had become one of Japan's central strategic problems, and it had nothing to do with pilot skill or American tactics. Japan couldn't reliably mass-produce a high-power aircraft engine to replace the Sakai the way the airframe increasingly needed. The Kinsei engine Horikoshi had wanted from the very beginning of the program eventually got paired with a Zero airframe, but only as the A6M8, and only as two prototypes, appearing in 1945, far too late in the war to matter, while an earlier attempt to boost performance with a turbo-supercharged variant, the A6M4, failed outright due to shortages of the specific alloys the design required. Trace the variant history, and the pattern is unmistakable. The A6M3, appearing in 1941, was still recognizably the same light, nimble airplane that had dominated over China, refined rather than re-engineered, but by the time the A6M5 reached squadrons in late 1943, the airframe had been asked to absorb the weight of additional armor plate, heavier armament, and self-sealing measures around the fuel tanks, all reasonable, even overdue responses to 2 years of combat losses, without ever receiving the more powerful engine that would have let it carry that weight without sacrificing the performance edge it was built around in the first place. Each individual upgrade was a rational response to a specific combat lesson. The cumulative effect, absent the engine to match, was an airplane slowly engineering its own signature advantage away. This kind of structural bottleneck shows up in modern supply chains constantly. When a single upstream constraint, one component, one material, one manufacturing capacity limit, quietly caps what an entire downstream system can achieve, no matter how much the design team on the other end improves everything they actually control. A modern automaker can redesign a car's chassis, its software, its battery management, all in a single product cycle, but if it doesn't control its own supply of a critical rare earth material, the best design in the world still ships with whatever that supply chain allows. Horikoshi's team could and did keep refining the Zero's airframe throughout the war, but what they couldn't do was hand their pilots an engine with meaningfully more power, because Japan's industrial base simply couldn't deliver one at scale. Every successive Zero variant, the A6M3, the A6M5, and its own variants, added incremental armor, self-sealing tank measures, and heavier armament in response to combat losses, but every addition raised the aircraft's weight, and every added kilogram ate directly into the low-wing loading that had been the Zero's defining early war advantage. By the A6M5 Model 52, wing loading had climbed to 128.3 kilograms per square meter, still light by wartime standards, but a meaningful step away from the featherweight maneuverability of the original A6M2. The airplane was becoming heavier and better armed at exactly the moment its engine power had stopped growing to match, a mismatch set in motion back in 1938, when the Navy chose the Zuisei over the Kinsei. Japan did attempt to design an outright successor rather than simply patching the Zero indefinitely. That aircraft, the Mitsubishi A7M Zero, never reached combat, and by most accounts suffered from essentially the same design tension that had shaped the Zero from the beginning, an airframe still caught between the demand for range and maneuverability on one side, and an industrial base that couldn't consistently deliver the engine power to support a genuinely new performance class on the other. The country that had produced one of the most maneuverable fighters of the early war never solved the underlying engine problem well enough to produce a true second act. This is the battle referenced at the very start. On June 19th and 20th, 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, American carrier aircraft, Hellcats prominent among them, met a Japanese carrier air fleet that was, by this point in the war, increasingly staffed by pilots with a fraction of the flight hours their 1941 counterparts had carried into combat. According to official Naval History and Heritage Command records, the United States lost 123 aircraft and 109 men killed across the engagement, and in exchange American forces destroyed nearly 600 Japanese aircraft, sank 2 Japanese fleet carriers, a light carrier, and 2 oilers, and killed nearly 3,000 Imperial Japanese Navy pilots and sailors. On June 19th alone, The day American aviators nicknamed the fight the Marianas Turkey Shoot, 346 of those Japanese aircraft went down. Some accounts put the losses even higher in relative terms, that of roughly 430 Japanese carrier aircraft committed, as few as 35 survived. That engagement looked strikingly different from the Japanese cockpit compared to 2 years earlier. In 1942, a Zero pilot going into combat could reasonably expect his own skill and his aircraft's maneuverability to matter enormously in the outcome of an individual engagement, and the historical record from Coral Sea and Guadalcanal backs that up directly. By June 1944, a Japanese pilot climbing into a Zero over the Philippine Sea was, on average, considerably less experienced than his 1942 counterpart, flying an airframe that had gained weight without gaining engine power to match, against American pilots flying aircraft purpose-built to deny exactly the kind of turning fight the Zero had once dominated. Individual skill and individual courage didn't disappear from that equation, but the structural advantages that had let a less numerous, less experienced Japanese air arm punch above its weight in 1941 and 1942 had, by 1944, reversed almost completely and reversed in the American direction. Every element of this story converges in that result. The airframe whose low-wing loading had once made it unbeatable in a turn was now facing purpose-built American fighters that refused to turn with it in the first place. The pilots flying it, in growing numbers, lacked the depth of combat experience their predecessors had carried in 1941 and 1942, the direct consequence of Japan's refusal to rotate its veterans out of combat. And the airframe itself, heavier with every successive variant and never matched with the more powerful engine its own chief designer had wanted from the beginning, could no longer outclimb or outrun what it was facing. This isn't a story about one design flaw being exposed in a single afternoon. It's the compounded result of decisions made across 7 years, the 1937 specification, the 1938 engine choice, the 1942 arrival of tactics built specifically to defeat it, and the industrial ceiling that kept the airplane from ever being meaningfully upgraded to answer any of it. The Marianas Turkey Shoot didn't settle everything, and it's tempting to treat a battle this lopsided as a final verdict on the airplane itself. The A6M flying over the Philippine Sea in June 1944 wasn't a badly designed aircraft in any absolute sense, and Eric Brown's praise for the type's turning performance was based on flight testing that took place well after this battle. What the Turkey Shoot actually demonstrates isn't that the Zero had become a bad airplane. It's that an airplane's effectiveness was never really a fixed property of the airframe alone. It was always a function of the airframe, the pilot flying it, and the specific aircraft it happened to be facing on a given afternoon, and by June 1944, all three of those variables had shifted against Japan simultaneously. By October 1944, with the aircraft's conventional combat effectiveness in steep decline, the Zero was assigned a role its original designers had never conceived of. Organized kamikaze operations began that month at Leyte, and the Zero, the airframe built in 1937 around the promise of speed, range, and maneuverability, became the primary aircraft used in deliberate suicide attacks against American ships. A dedicated kamikaze variant, the A6M entered production in May 1945, built specifically for the role rather than adapted to it as an afterthought. There is a version of this story that treats that transition as simple, almost inevitable, an obsolete fighter repurposed because it had nothing left to offer as a fighter, but the research doesn't allow for a conclusion that clean. What it does allow is this, that an aircraft designed from its first specification around carrying the maximum possible fuel load for the maximum possible range was, for entirely different and far darker reasons, also extremely well suited to flying a very long distance on a mission with no return flight built into the plan at all. Stated plainly, that repurposing reveals something about the airplane's entire design history, and it deserves more than a grim footnote. Every structural decision examined earlier, the aggressive weight stripping, the missing armor, the enormous internal fuel capacity built into the wing itself, had been justified from 1937 onward as choices made in service of a fighter's mission, escort bombers over vast distances, dominate a turning fight, bring the pilot home. By late 1944, those same physical characteristics were being pressed into service for a mission with the opposite goal entirely. The range that once let a Zero escort a strike force to a target and back now let it reach a target it was never going to leave. This channel has covered the kamikaze program itself as its own dedicated subject, examining the doctrine, the volunteers and conscripts who flew those missions, and the strategic calculations behind adopting the tactic in the first place. What belongs here is narrower, simply that the aircraft most associated with that campaign in popular memory wasn't purpose-built for it, at least not initially. It was the same airframe already sitting in Japanese inventories in large numbers by late 1944, worn down in conventional combat, increasingly outmatched by American fighters, but still carrying the range and reliability its 1937 specification had demanded, repurposed for a mission its original design brief never anticipated and could not have anticipated, because the mission itself didn't yet exist when Horikoshi's team was drawing up the airframe. Jiro Horikoshi lived to see the end of the war he had built one of its most iconic weapons for, and his own words about that experience are on the record. This belongs in the story for a specific reason, rather than ending the analysis at the Marianas Turkey shoot or the kamikaze campaign. Everything covered up to this point has been the aircraft's operational history, engagements, exchange ratios, industrial constraints. This part is about the one person whose engineering decisions in 1938 shaped every one of those later outcomes, and about how that same person made sense of what his design was ultimately used for. In a diary later published as part of the memoir Zero, co-written with Masateko Kumiya, Horikoshi wrote about learning that Japan had gone to war, that when they awoke on the morning of December 8, 1941, they found themselves, without any foreknowledge, embroiled in war. He went further, placing blame specifically, writing that the majority of those who had truly understood the awesome industrial strength of the United States never really believed Japan would win the war, and he directed responsibility at what he called the blind politicians in power who had, in his words, dragged Japan into a hellish cauldron of defeat. When he returned to Nagoya after the city had been bombed and found his own former factory in ruins, Horikoshi described the city as a wasteland, charred and unspeakably desolate, and his former factory as a ghostly, steel-ribbed wreck, shattered by bombs and torn apart by the dispersal crews. Horikoshi never renounced the aircraft itself, and he went on to a long post-war career in Japanese aviation, later co-designing a commercial airliner, the Namco YS-11, and receiving Japan's Order of the Rising Sun, third class, in 1973. He died on January 11, 1982. His own writing makes clear he understood the Zero's story as inseparable from the political failure that had put it into a war he believed, from early on, Japan couldn't win. A specific tension runs through Horikoshi's own account, and naming it directly matters more than a simple redemption story or a simple story of regret would. By his own later writing, he understood as early as the war's opening months that Japan lacked the industrial capacity to beat the United States in a prolonged conflict, and he built one of the most effective weapons of that same war's opening years regardless. Those two facts sit next to each other in his own diary, without either one resolving the other. He didn't stop designing aircraft because of what he believed about the war's likely outcome, and he never claimed, later in life, that he should have. What he did do was locate the responsibility for the outcome specifically in the political and military leadership that started the war, rather than in the engineering work of the people who built the machines it was fought with. Every airplane discussed in this account, no matter how many were built or how completely they dominated a given phase of the war, eventually has to answer the same final question: what's left of it now, and what does the world that built it choose to remember about it? Of the more than 10,000 Zeros built across the war, somewhere between 25 and 40 complete airframes survive today. Most of what remains is static, and most of what flies does so on an American Pratt & Whitney engine, rebuilt into wrecks recovered decades after the war because so few original Japanese power plants survived intact. Exactly 1-0 in the world still flies with its original Nakajima-built Sakai engine, an A6M5 held by the planes. Of Fame Air Museum in Chino, California, built at Nakajima's Oizumi plant in May 1943, captured at a Slido airfield on Saipan in June 1944, and evaluated by roughly 25 American pilots after its capture, reportedly including Charles Lindbergh. By the research available, it remains the only authentic Zero flying anywhere with its original engine. Other surviving examples are scattered across the world in ways that trace the aircraft's entire wartime and post-war story. The Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum holds an A6M5 also recovered from Saipan. The National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, and the Australian War Memorial in Canberra both hold examples. And in Japan, the Yashikin Museum in Tokyo displays one, while the Yamato Museum in Kure, a facility built around the memory of the battleship examined in an earlier production from this channel, holds an A6M5A recovered from the bottom of Lake Biwa in 1978. As recently as 2024 and 2025, an A6M3 was returned to flying condition by a restoration company in Washington state for the Military Aviation Museum, a reminder that this restoration work is still actively ongoing more than 80 years after the type first flew. That scarcity has shaped how the Zero appears on screen. Because so few authentic examples survive and fewer still can fly, film productions depicting the aircraft, including Tora Tora Tora, The Final Countdown, and the television series Black Sheep Squadron, have relied on modified North American T-6 Texan trainers dressed to resemble Zeros, rather than the genuine aircraft. Most audiences who believe they've seen a Zero on screen have, in fact, seen a different airplane altogether, reshaped to stand in for one that almost never survived the war intact. In Japan, the aircraft's post-war cultural memory runs more complicated than either straightforward pride or straightforward shame. The 2013 film The Eternal Zero, based on a novel by Naoki Hayakawa, became the highest-grossing Japanese film of 2014 and was publicly praised by sitting political figures, while also drawing criticism from historians who viewed its portrayal as softening the war's meaning. Hayao Miyazaki's film The Wind Rises, released the same year, took a different approach, fictionalizing Horikoshi's own life and his relationship to the machine he built. And because the Zero became, by 1944 and 1945, the airframe most associated with organized kamikaze operations, its post-war symbolism in Japan stays inseparable from that history as well. The same aircraft remembered simultaneously as a genuine feat of 1930s engineering and as the delivery vehicle for one of the war's most devastating tactics. That the same film could be publicly praised by a sitting prime minister and simultaneously accused by historians of softening the war's meaning isn't really a contradiction unique to the Eternal Zero. It reflects fairly accurately how contested the Zero's entire legacy remains in Japan, more than 80 years after Horikoshi's team stripped the weight out of that first prototype. The aircraft can be, and is, discussed simultaneously as one of the standout pieces of aeronautical engineering of the interwar period and as an object inseparable from a war of aggression and a suicide campaign that killed thousands of the young men who flew it. Neither framing cancels the other out. Both are part of the same object's history, and any account of the Zero that tries to collapse that tension into a single clean verdict, purely a triumph of engineering, or purely a symbol of militarism, leaves out half of what the historical record actually shows. Go back to the specification that opened this account. In October 1937, the Imperial Japanese Navy asked for a fighter that could outturn anything in the sky, outrun anything in the sky, and outlast anything in the sky on a single tank of fuel, all at once, with no separate requirement demanding it protect the man flying it. Nakajima looked at that list and said it couldn't be done. Jiro Horikoshi said it could and built exactly what was asked for. For roughly 18 months, that airplane did everything the specification promised, And then the men on the other side learned not to fight it on its own terms, built machines specifically to deny it those terms entirely. And an engine Horikoshi had wanted from the very start never arrived in time to answer either problem. Everything covered in this account traces back to that same handful of decisions made years before a single Zero ever crossed paths with an American fighter. Weight stripped from the airframe in 1938 became the turning radius that dominated Chinese and Allied pilots alike in 1940 and 1941, and became the missing armor that turned every hit into a potential kill by 1943 and 1944. The engine the Navy refused in 1938 became the performance ceiling that no later variant could climb past. No matter how much armor or firepower Japanese engineers tried to add back onto an airframe that had never been built to carry it. Overclaimed victory reports from China in 1940 became a reputation for invincibility that outlasted the actual military reality by at least 2 years on both sides of the Pacific. None of these threads run as separate stories. They're the same decision, made once, in 1937 and 1938, playing out across 7 years of consequences. There's a reason this particular airplane keeps drawing renewed historical attention more than 80 years after that first flight over Kagamegahara. And it isn't really about the airplane's silhouette, or its association with the opening shock of Pearl Harbor, or even its grim final chapter as a kamikaze weapon. It comes down to the Zero being one of the cleanest available case studies of a much larger, much more general problem. What happens when a piece of engineering gets built to win the fight in front of it, with no structural accounting for the fight that comes after? Every institution that optimizes hard for an immediate, visible advantage, speed to market, short-term returns, a dominant opening position, runs some version of the same risk the Imperial Japanese Navy ran in October 1937, whether or not anyone involved recognizes it as the same risk at the time. When an aircraft is built to a specification that trades every ounce of protection for speed and range and maneuverability, and it dominates for as long as its enemies haven't yet adapted, that's not simply a design flaw waiting to be exposed. It was exactly the airplane its Navy asked for, doing exactly what it was built to do, for exactly as long as the world around it allowed it to.